Hi, everybody. It's time for another episode of At the Boundary, podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Glenn Beckman, Communications Manager at GNSI, and your host for today's At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, we welcome Dr. Mark Luther. He's an Associate Professor of Physical Oceanography here at the USF College of Marine Science, where he's the Director of the Ocean Monitoring and Prediction Lab. He's also heavily involved in research and work surrounding global deep-sea mining of critical minerals. More on that shortly. Last week, GNSI announced our latest academic and research partnership with the War Studies University in Warsaw, Poland. GNSI and War Studies University will engage in collaborative research, the exchange of visiting scholars, and the potential exchange of undergrad and grad students for independent or cooperative research efforts. We are excited for this new partnership. There's a link to the full press release in the show notes. A special shout out today to May Birch, the first president of the GNSI Future Strategist Program. May recently spoke to the USF Board of Trustees about her journey to USF and the role of GNSI in that journey. More importantly, she's also the latest star in the USF Boundless Bulls video series. Watch her story for yourself. We'll drop a link in the show notes. Congratulations, May. Finally, the latest issue of the Journal of Strategic Security is out. It's a special issue devoted exclusively to the topic of Afghanistan. This issue draws a direct line back to the conference and workshop we hosted in November, Rethinking Afghanistan, Strategic Competition in the Heart of Asia. Many of the ideas kicked around in that workshop have made it to the pages of this special issue. 15 articles in total from some of the world's leading authorities on Afghanistan. You can read it now online, but we'll also be printing this issue, featuring a foreword from GNSI Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, the former commander of U.S. Central Command. If you've never taken the opportunity to check out an issue of JSS, which is a top 20 military studies journal according to Google Scholar, this is the issue to finally do it. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, let's turn our attention downwards now, as in down to the bottom of the ocean, as that's where our guest today focuses most of his work. Dr. Mark Luther is an Associate Professor of Physical Oceanography here at the USF College of Marine Science. He's heavily involved in the deep-sea mining of critical minerals. He sat down with our Heather Ward, the publications coordinator here at GNSI, for a trip to the ocean floor.
I would like to say welcome, Dr. Luther, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I'm sure most of us are familiar with what traditional land-based mining is, but could you help us understand what deep seabed mining is?
Yeah, deep seabed mining actually comprises several different minerals. The most prolific or most abundant of these minerals are called polymetallic nodules. They're just little round balls that sit on the bottom of the ocean, just sitting there on the surface. They're various sizes depending on where they form, from about the size of a Swedish meatball up to the size of a cantaloupe. And they form over tens of millions of years from just the minerals that are concentrated in the deep ocean waters that slowly precipitate out over time to form these things. And so for those, we don't even like to call it mining. It's more extraction, because all you basically have to do is go pick them up.
Okay.
And the devices that are being designed to harvest them are based on potato harvesters. They look like combines, and you see pictures in the Midwest wheat fields that just crawl around on the bottom and rake these things up and put them in baskets or shoot them up a vacuum tube,
that's what's going to be my question. Is it like a vacuum that just kind of crawls along the bottom of the ocean floor?
There's several different designs. Some are more vacuum-based. Others, like I say, the particular group that we're working with has designed one that, again, is just a big rake. It rakes them up and sticks them in a basket, and the basket, when it's full, gets pulled to the surface. But there's other types of deep sea minerals as well that are being exploited, or at least explored for exploitation. Polymetallic crusts are basically made out of the same materials, but it's a hard crust that forms on the slopes of seamounts and mid-ocean ridges that actually do have to be like jackhammered up off of the bottom. And massive sulfide crusts are similar in that they're more akin to traditional surface mining, where there's some sort of a device that digs them up off the bottom. They're not typically buried. They're still sitting right at the surface of the deep ocean floor, but they have to be physically extracted.
That makes sense.
Means.
So it sounds like there are 3 different main types of deep sea mining, if I'm correct. What types of minerals would come out of what types of minerals are we mining from the ocean floor or one of these crevices or mountain ranges, if you will?
They're all, we consider critical minerals. The most valuable one is cobalt, but there's also nickel, copper, manganese, iron. When they were originally discovered back in the late 1800s, they called them ferromanganese nodules because they were the ones that they first found in the eastern Pacific Ocean were primarily comprised of iron and manganese. But the ones that are the most valuable right now are the ones that are really high concentrations of cobalt. Because cobalt is fairly scarce in land-based minerals, but it's fairly abundant in these deep sea mineral deposits.
Cobalt's very important today in a lot of our electric vehicle technology, our cell phones, things like that too. So
correct. That's the primary usage of them right now is that cobalt is the most expensive piece of or component of an electric battery, whether it's for a cell phone or an electric vehicle or the Tesla wall in your garage or whatever for solar systems. And if you try to make a cheaper battery, it's usually because you skimp on the cobalt. And if you skimp on the cobalt, those are the batteries that blow up. So, in fact, there was a young man, his father's a good friend of mine, that was killed in St. Petersburg a few years ago when a vape pen that had a cheap, low cobalt battery in it blew up in his face and it killed him and set the house on fire. And there was a case just a few months ago in New York City where an e-bike shop in Manhattan, a bike erupted in flames and burned down an apartment building, killed several people. So,
that's
be very
important.
wary of cheap electric batteries because the only way to make them cheaper is to skimp on the cobalt.
Yeah, that very real world concern there. And kind of building on that, how much of the global demand for critical minerals like cobalt or copper could deep seabed mining realistically meet compared to the land resources?
The estimates are that almost all of our needs for these critical minerals could be met by deep sea mineral deposits. Land-based mining is never going to go away, but if it was at scale the way we think that it can be, and I say we, I'm also President-Elect of the International Marine Minerals Society, although I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on the behalf of the society. It's estimated that the Cook Islands alone could supply all of our critical battery needs for the next 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And the bigger issue is that the land-based sources of these minerals are, one, they're harder to get to because you got to dig off a lot of overburden to get to them. They're typically lower in concentration in a lot of these minerals, particularly cobalt. And they're typically in places that are politically unstable and controlled by perhaps unfriendly nations. The deep sea mineral deposits, particularly in the Cook Islands, are about 10 to 100 times the concentration of cobalt as these land-based minerals as well. So there are many considerations, but
yeah, that makes sense. And at this time, there are no commercial scale deep sea mining operations that are currently going on. With that in mind, how close are we to a commercial deep sea mining operations? And then what steps would need to take place in order for that to happen?
There have been some test mining or test collection operations in the Eastern Pacific, a Belgian company called GSR, the division of a big marine construction company, DEMI. they designed a commercial scale collector vehicle, and they run it around part of what's called the Clarion Clipperton Zone, and have collected nodules in fairly large quantities that could be scaled up tomorrow if we had the environmental regulatory structures in place. They collected a lot of data on what the actual impacts of these deep sea mineral extraction activities are, and it was much less than had been feared. There's still obviously going to be destruction of deep sea ecosystem habitat, but the far field effects were much, much lower than and had been feared. One of those biggest effects is you're stirring up sediment. In the proposed so-called mining code, or the environmental regulations that will govern future scalable deep sea mineral extraction, there's equal square kilometers left undisturbed for every square kilometer that you are disturbing or extracting. And the fear was that the sediment stirred up by those collection activities would drift over the preserved areas and smother the ecosystems there. That didn't happen. The sediments settled out of the water column much more quickly than some of the theoretical considerations had thought was possible. So
that's what I was going to ask, because I know you had mentioned one of the ways to vacuum up, for lack of a better term, these polymetallic modules. There seems to be a plume that comes off the back end of that too. So that, they'll pull up the nodules, and then all of that debris will create like a debris field, if you will.
Correct. And in fact, a lot of the originally proposed technologies were based on deep sea oil field technologies, deep sea oil and gas operations. And they typically use what's called a riser. It's basically just a big tube that goes all the way down to the bottom, and they pump fluid up the riser. And the fluid carries the nodules with it, but it also carries a lot of sediment with it. Then when it gets to the surface, to the collector vessel or the control vessel, then you got to separate all that sediment from the nodules. The nodules are fairly fragile, so they get cracked up as they're bouncing around the inside of this big metal tube as well. So then you've got to dispose of all that sediment that you sucked up from 5,000 meters depth. 4,000 to 5,000 meters is where these things are typically found. And that was one of the biggest pollution things that were possible, is that plume. They're talking about jetting it down maybe a few hundred meters and releasing it into the water column. And from there, the ocean currents could carry it for miles and miles in any direction, depending on how strong the currents are. And that's kind of how I got involved in this, because I measure and model ocean currents and what those currents are transporting, be it sediment or biological matter or whatever.
So that brings me kind of my next question. Is there like an equivalent to an oil spill that could happen with deep sea mining?
Not in the terms of large-scale environmental impacts. We worked a lot on the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. There are still lingering effects from that, almost 15 years later now. Actually, we just had the 15th anniversary. It was April 20th. And oil is very toxic. These sediments are not typically toxic. The only real environmental damage is that they'll blanket other ecosystems and perhaps smother it. And so there's not a lot of toxicity in the mineral collection itself. There's some of these nodules have very low levels of radioactivity, but they've been able to determine that it's not a real concern. The radioactivity is low enough that you can shield it easily, and it's not going to cook anybody. So that's the biggest problem, is what happens with these sediment plumes, and in addition to the direct impacts of the collector vehicles on ecosystems, because there's not a lot of life down there, but there is some. Yeah. And people say that we haven't studied it enough. Well, we're hosting the 53rd annual underwater minerals conference in St. Pete Beach this fall. And so we've been looking at it for at least 53 years. And in fact, we skipped a few years. So it's more like 60 years that people have been looking really hard at this stuff. But the technology to really understand these deep sea marine ecosystems has not really existed until fairly recently. And so that's part of the big holdup, is making sure that we really understand what's going on down there with the biota, and how can we mitigate the damage to those deep sea ecosystems and extract these minerals in as minimally destructive a way as possible.
Absolutely. I know a lot of land-based mining operations are very toxic, have a lot of, horrible effects for not only the flora and fauna, but the people in the area too. So that absolutely makes sense. I know you had mentioned that there was a mining code of ethics. Who establishes that, and who enforces that, if you will?
Well, there are a couple of different bodies depending on where the minerals are being extracted. If it's in what we typically call international waters, or the area beyond national jurisdiction, it's the part of the deep sea, the deep ocean, that's outside of any individual nation's control. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, as we call it, every coastal nation has a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around their continental shelves or their borders. And where that 200-mile limit starts depends on the geology and geomorphology of the ocean bottom around a nation. But it's typically 200 nautical miles from the edge of whatever you define as the shoreline. And that can be contentious because different nations' EEZs overlap each other. And so there has to be treaties to determine where you draw that line. But a vast portion of the ocean is outside of any individual country's jurisdiction. And that's in the international maritime law, that's just known as the area for short. And under the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas was established the International Seabed Authority, which is headquartered in Jamaica for some reason. I'm now a representative of the International Marine Minerals Society to that body. I haven't had a meeting yet. I just was moved into this role. But they have established a mining code. They've been at this for 20 years, and they still haven't established a definitive mining code. They have a draft version of it. It's on their website. If you just look up the International Seabed Authority, it's all there. But it hasn't been formally adopted yet. And certain nations keep dragging their feet on it. They're either small nations, small island nations typically, that have fairly large EEZs and are opposed to any disturbance of the deep sea floor. Or there's certain larger nations. China is the main one. China has snapped up a lot of the licensed areas. ISA has granted licenses to different nations to explore their deep sea mineral deposits in the area. And China has taken up a large portion of those. I think they have 8 to 10 licenses out of 33 that have been granted. I have to look up the exact number. It doesn't pop off the top of my head. But
if this code of conduct was formally published and ratified, if you will, would that open the door to commercial scale deep sea mining, do you think?
Yes, there's several other developments that are going on that may make that whole thing moot. There was a provision in the ISA's charter that said that they had to establish this mining code by a certain date. Well, that date has passed. And the country of Nauru, who has partnered with a company called the Metals Company, a Canadian-based company, they're one of the most advanced in all of this. They have invoked a clause that says you have to issue exploitation licenses because you're past that deadline that was in your charter, so you're in violation. So they're basically saying, you've lost your right to regulate us. We're going to do whatever we want.
Huh.
And secondary to that, the metals company has set up a U.S. subsidiary. The U.S. has never signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, so we're not even represented at the ISA. We're not eligible to get a license from the ISA to explore any of these areas beyond national jurisdiction ourselves. But there's an obscure, or at least it was obscure until a few weeks ago, U.S. law passed in the early 1980s. It basically said the U.S. has sovereignty over the areas beyond national jurisdiction that have not already been claimed by someone else. And basically, we can do what we want in those areas. And so the metals company has invoked that and is basically proposing to thumb their nose at the ISA and go after some of these mineral deposits that they are already licensed by the ISA to explore.
That was going to be one of my questions. I know in April, at the end of April, an executive order was signed stating unleashing America's offshore critical minerals and resources. I was going to ask, did you think this order hinted that we might join the ISA? But from what you're saying, like it might be a moot point.
Every president since George H.W. Bush has signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, but the U.S. Senate has never acquiesced to that. I forget the exact language. They don't call it ratifying the treaty, but basically saying that, yes, the president is allowed to sign that treaty. And it's in our own national interest to sign this treaty because it establishes formally the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and even extensions to that if you have extended continental shelves, as Russia has tried to claim in the Arctic. But there are certain members of the Senate who are ultra-nationalist in their political bent and feel that signing on to this UNCLOS would give up our sovereignty over the seas and have always blocked it. And it only takes one or two senators to block something like that under the rules of the Senate. So that has gone on since Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms back when I was in college and grad school. So under this U.S. law, though, the U.S. is basically claiming that or these U.S.-based companies are claiming that we can just go ahead and do what we want in these areas where there isn't already some license block from the ISA. Compounded on that is that we have extensive EEZ areas in the Pacific Ocean around Guam and Midway and American Samoa and places like that are potentially chock full of these minerals as well. So we just had a conversation with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management last week about how we might encourage or accelerate exploration of those zones. Right now, there are no U.S. regulatory structures in place that would incentivize any commercial operators to go and explore these areas because there's no guarantee that if they find big deposits of these things, that they'll have rights to them. It's like the gold rush. People can jump your claim because there's no way to actually establish an exclusive claim to whatever you might find. So there's rulemaking underway right now, basically an extension of what's called the Outer Continental Shelves Act that established the rights for oil and gas drilling within our EEZ. To if you find oil and gas deposits, then they're yours. You can stake claim to them. And so they're trying to get that extended to also cover deep sea mineral deposits. I'm not up on the latest caveats there, but that's my understanding of it, at least.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. If you don't want to waste the resources if the resources that you find aren't even going to be yours. With that said, what key policies or investments do you think that the U.S. should prioritize right now to avoid falling behind in deep sea mineral access or innovation?
Well, one of the major provisions of the presidential executive order from a few weeks ago states that we should support friendly nations that have extensive deposits already identified within their exclusive economic zones, read Cook Islands. And I've been working with the Cook Islands government for about 6 years now to try to help them develop their own mining code, their own regulatory structures. And they're pretty much have done that. And they're simply waiting for funding to make sure that all the baseline environmental data are collected as specified in those regulations. Right now, they have granted 3 licenses to private companies to explore portions of their nodule deposits. Again, they have extensive fields of these polymetallic nodules just laying there on the bottom. It's not the other things where you have to go down and jackhammer it up. It's the nodules that you just rake up. And all 3 of the companies that have licenses from the Cook Islands Seabed Minerals Authority, it's their national counterpart to the International Seabed Authority. They've been relying on those companies to collect all that baseline environmental data that is required. Well, these companies are all funded by venture capitalists that are looking at, market pressures and various things. They're investing a lot of money now for something that might not yield a profit for 3 to 5 years into the future. So they just don't have the money that it takes. It's very expensive to collect this kind of baseline data. So we're working with the Cook Islands to try to encourage U.S. federal government agencies to invest money to collect this data that then would allow them to issue the licenses to begin extraction activities, exploitation activities of these minerals that would ultimately benefit the U.S. because these companies are all proposing to refine these minerals in the U.S. for U.S. interests. So it's a strategically important issue because most of the land-based sources, as I said earlier, of these minerals are controlled by China and other nations, not by the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems too, since the areas outside of countries' exclusive economic zones, their EEZs, that's kind of everyone's water, if you will. It's everyone's ocean out there. So having cooperation between other countries would seem pretty critical, I would think, and especially if it's within their EEZ. So with that brings me to my last question. What do you see as the most pressing policy or research question for the next 5 to 10 years in this space, whether that's environmental, economic, take that anywhere.
And in terms of research, just collecting the data, it's very difficult to collect data at 5,000 meters. That's at 3.5 miles below the surface of the ocean. And we can do it. We know how to do it. It just is expensive, particularly the biological data, because it requires sending remotely operated vehicles down that can crawl around on the bottom and pick up samples and then put sensors that are anchored to the bottom. That's sort of my specialty, that can sit there for 6 months to a year at a time, collect data, and then you go back and retrieve it. Then you've got to analyze all of that data. So those are the biggest issues right now. As I said, they've tested these collector vehicles, so the technology exists to bring the nodules up from the bottom at scale. But again, it just requires more of an investment in the technology. But they have tested these vehicles. They work. Again, the sediment plumes are an issue, but not as big an issue as originally thought. So that's where we are right now is somebody needs to come up with a big pile of money for us to go out and collect all this data. And then we can, or countries like the Cook Islands can begin issuing exploration or exploitation permits.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion today. It was very informative. And if people wanted to know more about you and your work, where could they find you?
Could go to the International Marine Minerals Society website. It's just immsoc.org, or our lab at the University of South Florida. It's just marine.usf.edu. My particular lab is cmps.marine.usf.edu.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to include those links in the show notes.
A special thanks today to Dr. Mark Luther, an associate professor from the USF College of Marine Science, for his conversation involving deep sea mining of critical minerals. That topic, critical minerals and resources, is one we're turning into a much bigger, much broader research initiative. There'll be much more to come in the future. Next week on At the Boundary, Catherine Kuzminski will be our guest. She's the Director of Studies at CNAS, the Center for New American Security, where she leads the center's work on national security human capital. She'll be discussing mobilization, recruiting, and training for the U.S. military. We've touched on this topic before, and we're all looking forward to hearing what Kate has to say. Thanks for listening today. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and let your friends and colleagues know about us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, and all the major platforms. Also, be sure to check us out on our socials. We're currently on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. We'd appreciate a like, follow, or subscribe while you're there. And before we go today, a reminder, next week is the Transatlantic Forum on Cybersecurity, the live virtual event we're hosting with the University of Paris-Saclay, Cyber Florida, and the USF Bellini College of Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and Computing. It'll be a live stream on our YouTube channel, Monday, June 23rd, 9 a.m. here in Tampa, 3 p.m. if you're in Paris. There's no cost to attend. Registration is open. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be worthy of attention and discussion. I'm Glenn Beckman. Thanks for listening today. We'll see you next week at the Boundary.